Are you ready to have success with your indoor seed starting? Then join me in this part 2 in our seed starting series. For the best success of your seed starting indoors is to know when your last average frost date is for your spring and summer transplants that you'll be starting indoors. And for fall, you'll want to know when your first frost date is. This way you can plan your timing just right to start those seeds indoors and have it just right to be planting them outdoors. If you don't happen to know when your first average frost date is or your last average frost date is, then go ahead and contact your local extension office and they'll be able to provide that date for you. Or better yet, just contact one of your well-seasoned gardeners in your area. One thing to know is when you gather up all of your seeds, you don't want to plant them all at the same time. This is one of the biggest mistakes that we see with excited new gardeners is they'll plant their peppers and their squash seeds all at the same time, and then you end up having problems. If you were to sow your pepper seeds indoors at the same time you do your squash seeds indoors, what's going to happen is your pepper plants take 8 to 10 weeks for them to germinate and grow big enough before they're ready to be planted outdoors. And squash, they only take 2 to 3 weeks before they're big enough to plant outdoors. So you can see that the squash plants are going to grow really big, and then they're going to become leggy and possibly root bound, and then they're not going to do so well when you plant them out when we have our frost-free dates. Most packages have some really good information on them that lets you know when you need to start sowing your seed indoors so that the plant can develop large enough to be transplanted out after your last frost date. The last average frost date is just an average of when you're going to have your last frost of the season. And then it's safe to start planting out your tender crops like eggplants, tomatoes, and peppers. Some crops and veggies can and should be planted out before this date. This just makes them taste a little bit better and they don't like that heat, but your seed packet will tell you that. Our last average frost date here in our Zone 8 is April 15th. So I'll take that April 15th and count back the 8 to 10 weeks, and that'll put me about February 1st to February 15th. This will give me ample time for them to grow up and be ready to transplant at or after that April 15th. I'll put a link below that lists when to plant your vegetables out before your average frost date. Just in case your seed packet doesn't list it, this will just give you some help. One of the best ways to organize your seeds is to find when you need to sow those seeds indoors. You can actually write it on the seed packet on the front so it's easy to see, and you can write them on a calendar. That way you can follow it on the calendar that I need to plant this on this day and this on this day. But one of the things that I really like to do is to put them in my box. It's just a little file system that I have the months there. And then I'll put those seeds behind each month, and then I'll write on it if I'm going to sow it in the greenhouse or outdoors, and I'll put the date on it. And each month I'll go through that box, and it makes it really easy to know what I'm planting when. Now it's time to get our soil ready to start our seeds in. And if you missed on the types of soil that we use, then you can go to our part 1 of our seed starting series to find out more information about that. But we want our soil to be moist. If it's dry, whether you mix it or whether you buy bagged, then when we put it in our little pots, then it can act a little hydrophobic, and it's hard to get that water in every little nook and cranny. And sometimes we end up washing or flushing our seeds away. And so we definitely want to have nice moist soil when we add them to our pots. This soil here is just a slight bit dry, and so what I want to do is just sprinkle some water in this bucket and then just mix it up really good so it's evenly moist like a wrung out sponge. Now, if your soil is already moist because it was out in the rain or for whatever reason, then you don't want to add water to it because we don't want it to be soggy when we're adding it to our little seed pots. Now that I've added water to my soil that was just a little bit dry, it's just the right consistency. I mixed it really well, and then I squoze it to test it. No water came out, but it almost stuck together, and that's just what I want for my soil mix. And so now I'm going to go ahead and start filling all of my pots. Now that our soil is ready, it's time to fill our pots. And fill your larger pots to about 1/4 inch from the top, and then the cells, go ahead and fill them all the way to the top and then just smooth them off. Once those are filled, then I usually just take my fingers and make a little depression in each one of these cells. And then on my bigger pots, I'll use another pot the same size just to kind of settle that soil in just a little bit before we start planting our seeds. One of the reasons that I like to kind of settle that soil in with either my fingers or another pot is because when we water, that settles the soil down just a little bit. And when we put tiny seeds in there, such as lettuce, then those lettuce if it wasn't settled, could actually kind of work their way down with the settling and get too deep and make it harder for them to germinate. I've been starting seeds for a good many years, and I've got my own niche of the types of pots that I use for certain types of starts that I start. I use the large pots for peppers and tomatoes, and I love the cells for starting beets in that I'm going to go direct sow outside. And I love to use the trays for starting a large amount of onions because they love to be transplanted. And this just saves me a lot of space when I use cells in these trays for things like this. So you'll end up getting your own groove after you've done this just a few times. Now here's the part we've all been waiting for, and it's time to sow our seeds. So this is a really good time to refer back to our package for the depth that we need to be planting each seed, because they all need to be planted at different depths. Bean seeds are going to need to be planted deeper because they are a bigger seed. As opposed to a lettuce seed, then we don't want to be planting them very deep because they're a tiny seed, and it's going to be really hard for them to come up through the soil if we put too much soil over the top of them. So general rule of thumb is plant them to the depth of the size of the seed. There's a couple of things that I never sow indoors in pots, and that's taproots, long taproots like carrots and parsnips and daikon radishes. These guys are really hard to transplant out and get them to where they go straight down. Generally, they end up being a little weird and they never do so good. So it's really not worth the time to be doing that. So just direct sow those. The amount of seeds that you put in each pot will all depend on the method that you're using. Now, if you're a beginner, I would suggest just doing 1 to 2 seeds per pot for things like peppers and tomatoes and broccoli. And then if you're doing smaller seeds like the lettuces and arugula, then do 5 to 6 seeds per pot. That way, you don't have to transplant them into a larger pot, and they can just grow in that same pot until it's time to transplant outside. Another option is to sow several seeds in one of these little pots. I like to put about 25 per pot. This is one of the things that we do here on our little farm and for our nursery. We can put a lot of seeds in a little space, but once they've germinated and then they've grown to be about 1 to 2 inches tall, then we have to prick them out and transplant them into their own pot, their own individual pot. One of the other things that I really like to do is plant in these cells. I'll put 1 seed per cell, but I have to watch these because they can get root bound and overgrow in these very quickly and then become unhealthy. So you can take these little guys and transplant them right out into your garden, or you can transplant them into a bigger pot. For larger seeds like beans and peas and squash, I like to just take these seeds and just push them right into the soil. You could use just a little pencil to make a hole and drop them in there. Just make sure you get the proper depth for each one of these large seeds. Once we've sown our seed, we want to cover it with some soil. Now remember, we're only covering to the depth of the size of that seed of its greatest point. So lettuce seed, we're barely putting some soil over the top of them. The ones that we've pushed down into the soil, obviously we don't need to bury those. And the other seeds, just a little bit of soil over the top to the same size of that seed that we planted. Now it's time to water our seeds, and we want to use a soft watering wand or a mister, just something that offers a light amount of moisture so that we don't disturb that soil and displace those seeds. If you're starting your seeds indoors in a windowsill, then you don't have the humidity that you would in a cold frame or a greenhouse. So using the dome that the little kits come with, or even a plastic bag if that's not how you're starting them, just to keep that humidity up is a really good idea. I always like to leave them open just a little bit so that you can have some airflow though. Wherever you're starting your seeds, make sure that they have that 10 to 12 hours of light so that they get the best start. Remember, we talked about that in our part 1, and you can go back and refer to that for more information. If you have a seedling heating mat, then go ahead and get it plugged in and put your seedlings on top of it to get that germination process going. Now, don't be using any of the human heating pads for this process. For one, it gets too hot, and the other, they're not meant to be used around water. These are a completely different device. As you're sowing your seed, don't forget to put labels in each one of your pots. Now, if I'm doing cells, I'll put one in the front of the cell, and everything in that row will be whatever this label says. And I always like to put a date on it as well. That way I know how long it's been in the ground, and if it doesn't come up within a few weeks, I know that there might be a problem. Keep an eye on your seedlings. You want your soil to stay evenly moist but never soggy. I don't like my seedlings to ever be in standing water because this is just asking for trouble. You can easily get dampening off, which is a fungal disease, and this is usually caused by too much moisture. What they'll do is they'll rot on the stem, they'll flop over, and there is no recovery for this. It's not a good idea to let your seedlings dry out completely either. There is a happy medium. You want it to be like a wrung out sponge, but you don't want it to be a dry, shriveled sponge either. Now be patient. Some seeds are really quick to germinate, like these Napa cabbages. 2 days on a heating mat and they've already popped their little heads through the soil. But peppers can take up to a couple of weeks before they germinate. And even some herbs can be up to a year or 2 years. And this is why a really good idea to make sure that you label all of your seedlings. Keep watering those seedlings, offering them a warm environment, especially for those flowers and vegetables that grow in the warm season. And I'll see you in part 3 of our seed starting series on how to care for our young seedlings. Till next time, see ya! Actually going to be getting up.
Extra.
Not really.
We're going to do one more.
Well, or 5. Or your frost ends. Do I need to do that? My pepper seeds indoors. I don't know. Bigger. I don't know. You need a little bit more specific. Your seeds, if you... That was dumb.